Hey class, in this video I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the categorical proposition, which is the subject of this week's module. So to begin with, we should talk about what a proposition is. And in a language there are many kinds of sentences, right? In grammar, if you think about just basic punctuation, we have 3 punctuation marks: a period, a question mark, and an exclamation point. The proposition is essentially the kind of sentence that ends with a period. What does that mean? Well, a proposition is a sentence that asserts something to be the case or to not be the case. Basically, it asserts that something is true or something is not true. A question mark doesn't do that, right? A question mark is asking, is there a hammer in the garage? That sentence is not saying whether or not there actually is a hammer, it's just asking if there is one. A sentence ending in an exclamation point is an order, as in, get me the hammer, or it expresses surprise, like, ah, right? The kind of sentence that ends with a period is a sentence that affirms something to be the case. It says, there is a hammer in the garage, or the hammer is over there. In categorical logic, we're only concerned with sentences that affirm something to be the case or not. Why is that? Because those are the sentences that can be true or false. A question is not true or false. A question is asking. It's not asserting. So while the answer to a question can be true or false, the question itself is not true or false. Similarly with exclamations or commands, they are not true or false. Only sentences ending in a period can be true or false. Now, there are an infinite number of possible sentences ending with a period that we could form. And in logic, especially in categorical logic, we're only concerned with one specific kind of sentence, and that's called the categorical proposition, right? So a proposition is just a sentence that can be true or false, right? Typically ending in a period. So what do we mean by categorical? Well, Aristotle's logic is a logic of categories, right? One of the first books he wrote, one of his earliest works, is a text just called The Categories. And the way Aristotle thinks about things is that everything falls into some kind of category. So take this, right? Aristotle would say we have this and we can categorize it a number of different ways. We can categorize it as a knife, right? So this falls into the category of knives. Then we can also categorize it as colored, right? It's green. It falls into the category of green things. It falls into the category of like knife things. It falls into the category of sharp things, falls into the categories of physical things. It falls into the category of things that I let my son play with, but I don't let his mother know, and other categories like that. So for Aristotle, any given thing, right, is going to fall into many categories. And in fact, his logic is so sort of categorical that even individuals are thought of as categories with just one member. So I fall into the category of Brian Harding, and you fall into the category of you, right? And it's just a category that has just one member. And that'll be important later on as, we get deeper into some of the details of categorical logic. So the categorical proposition is a proposition that relates different categories to each other. And there's a basic form of the categorical proposition. One of the things that Aristotle will do is he'll realize that sentences can get so weird and sentences can get so odd that if we're going to have a functioning logical system, we have to sort of basically bend and fit all of the sentences into roughly the same form so that we can more easily compare and contrast them. So there's what we could call the general form of a categorical proposition. Now, the first part, the first word in a categorical proposition is going to be your quantifier. The quantifier just tells you how much of something. Now, if you think about all the words we have for numbers, you'd realize that there could be a ton of quantifiers. Right? A ton would be itself a quantifier. And again, to simplify these things, Aristotle is going to boil down our quantifiers to really just 3 or 4, depending on how you count them. And those quantifiers are all, some, and none. Those are the only quantifiers we're going to have, except for that, you could say every instead of all, and it would mean the same thing. But all, some, none. Those are your quantifiers. Almost every categorical proposition is going to begin with either all, some, or none. Now, you might say, well, which categorical propositions don't begin that way? Generally speaking, ones with proper names, right? Like, if I say Socrates is mortal, I don't need to say all Socrates is mortal, because I know that there's only one Socrates. But, just as an aside, Socrates is a category with only one member, so it would be true to say all Socrateses are mortal. But we'll leave that be for now. So we have the quantifier. That's the first word in the sentence. All, some, or none. We then have the subject. The subject is the thing you're talking about. Right? It might sound like the grammatical subject of the sentence. And the logical subject and the grammatical subject in propositional logic generally line up. So if I say the knife is sharp, then the knife is the subject. Right? If I say some knives are sharp, then some is the quantifier and knives is the subject. It's the category of things that I'm talking about. And what's happening is the quantifier is telling you how many things in that category we're talking about. If I say some knives are sharp, then you know that I'm talking about at least one knife, but not all of them, because there could be dull knives. If I say all knives are sharp, then you know that I'm saying that sharpness adheres to everything in the category of knives. All right, so we have our quantifier, we have our subject, and then we have the copula. The copula is basically the verb, and we only use one verb in categorical logic, and that's the being verb, to be. And so that would be is or are, depending on how many things you're talking about. We also add is not and are not. Now, you'll notice that when I flash those up on the board, I put hyphens between them. And although we won't get into the technicalities, it's important to know what's being negated. Are you negating the verb, or are you negating what we're going to talk about in a minute, the predicate? And so I like to use hyphens just to clarify that. In other languages, you don't have to use hyphens. Like in Latin, they could do it with word order, similarly in Greek. But in modern languages that rely more heavily on word order to determine the meaning of the sentence than ancient languages, which use a system of declensions, and you don't have to worry about that if you don't know what I'm talking about, we have to use hyphens. All right, so now we have quantifier, subject, copula, which is or are, is not, are not. Then the last part of our categorical proposition is the predicate. And the predicate is another category. If I say some knives are sharp, predicate, sharp, is another category, right? It's the category of things that are sharp. And so that is the standard form of categorical proposition. Quantifier, subject, copula, predicate. And what we'll do in categorical logic is we'll try to regiment our language so that all of the things we're talking about and analyzing are fitted into the form of a categorical proposition so that we can then churn it through our logical machinery and see what works and what doesn't. Now, you might say, why do we want to do this? This seems kind of stupid and boring, and I don't like you. Well, ultimately, the reason we want to do this is because this will help us to see the structure of the arguments that people are making and see whether that's something that we should believe, or if that person is maybe trying to pull a fast one and trick us, or if they just don't know what they're talking about. But the first step to any kind of project like that is organizing your tools. And your tools in logic and critical thinking are essentially words, sentences, language. And this is a way of organizing your language so that you can do these other projects. So the categorical proposition, right, has quantifier, subject, copula, predicate. There's a certain way that they think about the copula that's worth understanding. Aristotle thinks, and categorical logic in general, thinks of affirmation like is, or negation like is not, in terms of joining and separating. Right? So when I say some knives are sharp, I'm joining the category of knives with the category of sharp. Right? So the affirmation is a joining of two things. The negation is a separation. So if I say some knives are not heavy, I am separating some knives from the category of heaviness. But again, if I say some knives are sharp, I'm joining these two things together. And it's important to understand this way of thinking, and it took me a long time to understand it. Yeah, it took me a long time to understand it because my teacher, when I was taking logic and critical thinking, never bothered to explain it. But once you understand that, or once you keep that in mind, then it'll make more sense later down the line when I start explaining why two negative propositions can't form a valid conclusion. And we haven't gotten to that yet, so don't worry. But when I was in your shoes and my teacher was talking about that, I was like, I don't understand why. This doesn't, like, yes, I'll remember the rule, but I don't understand why that is the rule. 20 years later, I figure out that the reason that is the rule is because what you're doing is separating when you have negative propositions like is not and are not. So that's something later. So the moral of the story today is the categorical proposition. Right? Now, once you get the standard form of the categorical proposition, right, quantifier, subject, predicate, copula, it's quickly discovered that there are essentially four kinds of propositions, right? That all of the four, or we might say four basic forms of a proposition. And we get those four basic propositions by combining different patterns of some or all, is and is not. That gives us the four basic kinds of categorical propositions, which have names. Their names are A, I, E, and O. And you'll see that you can imagine a square there. They get their names from Latin. There you have affirmo and nego. Affirmo means I affirm, nego, I negate, or I deny. But you can think of negative. The affirmo, A and I, are your affirmative propositions, ones that say is. Your nego are your negative propositions, the one that say is not. So your A proposition is universal, affirmative. That's all S is P. Your I proposition is particular affirmative, some S is P. Right? So that's the difference between saying that all knives are sharp and saying some knives are sharp. Right? So that's your universal. Your universal affirmative is all knives are sharp. Your particular affirmative is some knives are sharp. The negos, your E proposition is a universal negative. That'd be all knives are not safe. And your O proposition is a particular negative. Some knife is not safe. We'll talk more about these 4 propositions and how they relate next week when we get to the square of opposition. But for now, for today, your takeaway should be the basic form of the proposition, the basic form of the proposition, quantifier, subject, copula, predicate, which then gives you the 4 basic A, I, E, and O sentences. And then remember that in the affirmative proposition, we are joining things together, and in the negative, we are separating them.